Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Today's research talk makes us travel to Japan. And on this occasion, we have the pleasure to welcome Professor Stian O'Connell from Nanzan University. Professor O'Connell will explain to us how to make the most out of intercultural diversity in the workplace for research and PhD training. As workplaces, including research institutions around the world, become increasingly diverse, the need for intercultural communication skills and cultural intelligence has heightened. As such, this presentation will seek to introduce some common mindsets and strategies that will help researchers and PhD candidates alike get the most of intercultural diversity they might experience. So as for today's guest, Professor O'Connell is currently a full professor at the Faculty of Policy Studies, Nanzan University in Japan, where he teaches courses in intercultural business analysis, Japanese English interpreting, and intercultural workplace communication skills. He earned his PhD in intercultural communication in 2011 from the University of Queensland, Australia, and his current research interests include intercultural workplace communication, high performance culture facilitation, and multicultural studies curriculum design. So, Professor O'Connell, thank you so much for having accepted our invitation as guest speaker. We are really, really honored to have you with us today because we know that it's not always easy to set aside time, right, to be here with us. So it's really a honor, and we are really we are really grateful to be able to benefit from your presence. And so I would say that without further delay, I will give you the floor so we can start on time and finish on time.
Wonderful. Thank you for the kind introduction. Okay, let me begin by first sharing my screen so you can see the slides that I'll be referring to. So I'll just set that up. Okay. Hopefully everyone is able to see the screen without any problems. Okay.
It's fine.
Yep.
I can see it.
Wonderful. Okay. So, yes, making the most out of intercultural diversity in the workplace for research and PhD training. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here with you all. And today I'd like to spend about 40 minutes going through some very basic concepts that I find work well with regard to this theme. So, first of all, just to give you a quick outline of what I'm going to be doing. Uh, I'll begin with a bit of background about myself to just put that into context because it does really link to the theme today. I'll then like to shift the focus onto what we're talking about here, which is basically, trying to foster, to nurture, to gain cultural intelligence that works well in what we're doing in terms of our jobs as teachers, as researchers, but also when we are guiding PhD candidates or graduate school candidates from diverse backgrounds. And I'll end the presentation with a bit more context, putting it into a Japanese context and what I'm experiencing here now in Japan. And perhaps you'll be able to take away something from that. It might resonate within you some similar experiences you have, and hopefully, by the end, I'm sure all of you already have this cultural intelligence, but it might heighten the consciousness of it, and hopefully you'll find some ways or some hints as to how to further utilize that. So anyway, let me begin first with a bit of background. As you can perhaps tell from my accent, Um, it's not British. However, the reason for the UK flag here is just this is the fact that I was actually born in England. However, when I was 5, we moved to a country that created the accent I have now, which is New Zealand. So I was raised in New Zealand. I went to school there. I went as far as my undergraduate studies there. My major was Japanese language and with a specific focus on the tourism industry and also interpreting and translating. At high school, I was fortunate enough to study Japanese in New Zealand, and that led me to first come to Japan in 1986 as an exchange student at a high school for 1 year. I spent a year in Yokohama. That further, I guess, motivated me to continue my studies. And from there, I went back to New Zealand. And after graduating, I didn't go straight into academia. I first worked in the tourist industry for a Japanese travel company in New Zealand. In 1995, I then moved back to Japan, and I've been in Nagoya ever since. So that's 28 years now in Nagoya, a year in Yokohama. I will be 54 this year, so over half my life has been spent in Japan. And going from a tourist industry career into next, which was a translating, interpreting career, I finally found myself in the world of academia. So I'm not a pure academic as such, and I try to take what experience I've had outside of the academia sort of context I'm in now, and I try to utilize that in a way that's beneficial not only for the students but also for the colleagues that I work with. So I hope to share some of that with you today. As was kindly explained in the introduction, my focus and my research is on intercultural workplace communication. My PhD, and I won't go into too much about it because it could take forever to explain, but it was a practical approach looking at the communication dynamics of foreign expatriates in Japan who were bilingual and how they utilized their cultural intelligence, that cultural knowledge, and how that affected the way they communicated with their Japanese co-workers. And from there, I was able to find different strategies that were used both successfully, intentionally, as well as those strategies that were used that didn't go so well, or there was a diverse approach to the communication to perhaps achieve a different communication goal that the Japanese weren't expecting. So it revealed a lot of different points that were not only good for the research itself, but also it was a chance for me to look at myself from the outside through other people. And in that regard, I've been able to use that knowledge not only in my current research, but also in my everyday sort of workplace sort of practices. So anyway, let's get into the main part of today's presentation, and I'd first like to start by discussing, or for us to think a little bit about cultural intelligence. There are many different ways to explain this skill. Some people would call it intercultural communication skills, intercultural understanding. But I think the word cultural intelligence itself, from the world of multiple intelligences, including things like emotional intelligence, social intelligence, I think it sits quite well, and it has a nice ring to it as well. So it's very digestible. It's a term I often use now because it is an intelligence that we need to use, especially when we're working in diverse contexts or we're dealing with students, research students from different cultural backgrounds as well. Having this mindset in place can help us perhaps deliver our message more successfully. It also can help us build good rapport, trust, and good communicative relations with the people that we're dealing with. So, anyway, I'll start with a question for you all. What is communication? Just take a couple of seconds to think about how do you communicate? It sounds like a very simple question, but obviously sometimes we're not aware of all of the things that define communication. For me, I always try to be aware of four different areas when I'm communicating, especially when we talk in the context of intercultural diversity. And those four areas are first the verbal communication that we use, which can include things like speaking, listening, reading, and writing. In the world of online now, we have wonderful tools like Zoom and Teams, and we we can use this virtual world to communicate. But as I'm doing now, some of that is not just what we write in an email, it's how we express ourselves verbally in terms of what we say, how we hear things. And so being aware of that being an important cog in the communication wheel is something we should be aware of or conscious of. Another part, of course, is the non-verbal aspect. And the non-verbal aspect, of course, includes things like our body language, the gestures we use, the eye contact we maintain, the facial expressions, and something like silence. Now, the reason I talk about these things is that communication happens all around the world in any one culture setting or any diverse setting. But the way we define these within ourselves or the way we use them differs depending on the culture. So one person's use of silence could have a very different meaning to another depending on your cultural background. Another area, of course, is paraverbal. Not a word we hear often, but this is kind of a link between the verbal and the non-verbal, and it includes things like the speed that we speak at, the tone that we use, and the volume in our voice to project confidence, seriousness, etc. But when we look at the intercultural side of things, one other part of communication we should be aware of course, is the situational communication that we use. Again, quite an abstract term, but what this refers to are things like the choice of language, the style of communication. That could be something like being a very direct communicator or preferring a more indirect way. And that's something we'll look at later on in this presentation. And of course, depending on the culture, there are certain levels of social appropriateness, how to speak, when to speak. And knowing these things, and that's the reason why I bring the Japanese context into it at the end as a point of reference. By being aware of these things and opening our minds to different being another normal, we can learn and pick up different levels or different types of situational communication that we can show an understanding of, but we can also explain what is normal for us as well. So to me, part of cultural intelligence is looking at this communication aspect. Another part, of course, is the word culture itself. And here you see, you know, maybe an iPhone and an Android. And this is often a reference I use when I explain the dynamic side of culture and how it links to cultural intelligence. So to me, the way I express culture is through what I call my own operating system. Hofstede calls it software of the mind. But basically, when we are in one culture, we're basically sharing behaviors, values, and communication styles within that group that are expected, that are accepted, and that are considered normal. So, for us to become better communicators in an intercultural workplace where there's more diversity, we have to try and create different partitions in our communicative brain that we can switch from one operating system to the other, or even perhaps blend the two. And so that's what I'd like to talk a little bit more about. So when we talk about culture in that regard, and the dynamic side of it, what we're basically talking about are four different things. First of all, the mindsets. This is the values, the way we think, the opinions we form, our worldviews. It is also the style of communication we are most comfortable with. Another area, of course, are the customs that are attached to that. the different customs and daily life that we perhaps aren't conscious of that we do, but are considered normal in that context. And of course, another area is the behavior that we display. So, to become more cultural intelligent, we need to be able to, as I said before, have two or three different operating systems that we can access. But it's very much a two-way street. It's not just one person doing all the adapting, but it's very much how to create a blended culture in the end. So, for me, that is really the base of what I consider to be good intercultural communication. And the reason I prefer this word intercultural rather than cross cultural is that I feel the word inter relates more to that blending, that meeting halfway, rather than perhaps cross cultural, where we can see a cross, which really defines differences more rather than focusing on the interaction. So I often use this word rather than the term cross cultural. But anyway, the aim, as I said, is to create a shared culture, and in a diverse workplace, this is what we're looking to do. So, as I explained before, I was born in England, so we can take that as one example. I'm now in Japan. Okay, so what a shared culture means is that we're looking to meet in the middle. We're creating more of a third culture. And so what happens is, as we share that cultural intelligence and we establish some rules and we're more aware of each other's commonalities as well as the areas we might be different, we end up blending the two on both sides. And in the middle, as you can see here, we see a nice blend of the two where you're going both ways rather than one doing all the work. So it does take a lot of effort, but it's that state of consciousness that you have which will guarantee, a higher chance of success rather than over being very stressed about making all of the effort. That's one thing we want to avoid. But to do that, we need to be aware of different things. And the first thing is we need to be aware of ourselves. It's very much about knowing yourself, being able to explain yourself. And what I mean by the cultural lens here is that the way that you interpret something, uh, your worldview, for example, and that very much drives the the standards that you have, the norms that you have, very much culturally influenced. And from there, you have your own perceived reality of the world. So our culture really shapes, or our cultural identity really shapes these things. But in order for us to become more culturally intelligent, to become more adaptive, to become more sensitive, we need to be able to change that lens. So, as I referred to before, the operating system partitions. And by changing the lens to a different cultural lens, we're then able to gain higher cultural intelligence. So, we start off by looking at ourselves rather than looking at the other person and trying to determine how different or how similar they are. Because in any case we find ourselves in, when we're talking about a culturally diverse setting, there is some negotiation, some compromise going on. So we first need to be able to, I guess, convince each other of our beliefs, of what our expectations are. We need to explain that, and then by doing that, we create a better mutual understanding. And it begins with this. And then with the way we can go about handling diversity, to me, and it's often referred to in the current literature, many people talk about the three C's when we are handling diversity. And we've basically got three choices. First, we can confront. And that means that we're always thinking we are right. rather ethnocentric approach, and again can create a barrier to embracing diversity. By doing that, by confronting, it also creates some negative feelings. And the second C, we find ourselves starting to complain. But what complaining does, without looking for a solution, is really just an avenue to isolating yourself. And to embrace a diverse setting, complaining about difference is not going to help. And I'm obviously, I'm stating the obvious here, but it's something I don't think is talked about enough. And the more diverse our settings become, the more we have to establish that shared cultural sort of environment. So those discussions, that dialogue, are always very important. And that leads me to the third C, which is conform. And this is a mutual approach, not just one conforming to the other, but accepting that something is diverse. And for me, I think this, out of these three C's, is the most important value to hold. And it's something to be very aware of. How does that relate to cultural intelligence? Well, with cultural intelligence, it's an ongoing cycle. And it's a bit of a checklist, really. And some of you may already be familiar with this area, some of you may not. But let's consider this and just think about how we can drive cultural intelligence within ourselves. And it all begins with a need. And that need is the culturally diverse setting we find ourselves in, whether it is working with colleagues from another country, whether it is supervising graduate students from different cultural backgrounds. We need some drive, we need some motivation. So we need to be motivated to heighten our own cultural intelligence. That drive is the base. Without that motivation, your cultural intelligence isn't going to be, something you can call upon. But to get cultural intelligence, obviously we need knowledge. So we need to enhance our cultural understanding. And I'll refer to this again and again, but that's not just how different is the person we're dealing with, but it's also very much about who are we, and being able to recognize that and explain that to each other. So by having some knowledge of the other person's culture, but also at the same time being able to explain your own, I think is a great start to building that mutual knowledge. Once you have that knowledge, the next step obviously is strategy. So how are we going to approach this culturally diverse setting? How different are our cultural styles? For me in Japan, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a moment, one thing that I constantly deal with, either with my colleagues or with my students, is a preferred indirect approach to communication. I'll explain that a bit more in a moment, but it's a lot of guesswork, reading between the lines. So when I'm communicating with them, and especially if I'm communicating in Japanese, I have to be very aware of the strategy I use. If I use an approach that's too direct, then it's not going to instill a positive reaction from them. And so by showing my cultural intelligence of the preferred Japanese style, it may be something where I have to take a longer way around to explain something. But in the end, I know my message will get across because I've done it in a way where the other person feels comfortable. Now, hopefully, as we create a more shared culture, they learn to reciprocate that and they will learn more about me and my preferences. And that's where that give and take relationship is created, born from the proper use of these strategies. So once you have your strategies in place, then it's just a matter of putting your plans into action. They're not always going to be 100% successful. However, you do learn from each exchange you have with the view of improving it as you go. So this cycle is a never-ending one that we add to. It's a toolbox, and we have different tools we can pull out of that box to handle different problems or different situations. So that gives you a brief sort of outline of what the frame of cultural intelligence is. Okay, and the benefits, obviously, this cultural intelligence becomes a key to success. The better you can use this tool by building your strategies, being motivated, gaining the knowledge, and putting those strategies into action, you end up being able to increase the performance of the team that you work with. You also can create diverse problem solving um, environments because it is a two-way relationship. And by being open to each other, you're able then to create a compromise that works well for both sides. And obviously, if we're going to think of it in critical thinking terms, once we've recognized, understood, and analyzed the problem, we're looking for a solution. But in intercultural diverse situations, we're looking for a shared solution that is, for lack of a better word, a compromise more than one person getting their own way and the other folding. So it's a cliche term. It's a win-win situation, but we can derive more diverse problem solving techniques by being aware of the benefits of the use of cultural intelligence. And naturally, that requires a lot of communication. And so, better communication is born out of this. It's not something that happens overnight. However, it is something that both sides aim for, and then they, in the end, have a shared definition of what good communication is for that context. And I think that is the base to work from. So let's move into a Japanese context for a bit of a reference regarding that. So, first of all, and I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with the Japanese context. Maybe we do have some people that have had a lot of dealings with Japanese colleagues, co researchers, perhaps even students you have supervised or been in contact with. But to understand where they're coming from leads to ways in which you can use your cultural intelligence if you understand their background. So, first of all, when we look at learning and the way they're taught, it can be a point of frustration, I'll be honest. It does have its benefits, but when you come from a critical thinking educational background like I have, this first point, rote learning, can be a bit stressful. Japanese are taught, I would say in elementary school, it is more of a critical thinking approach. There is a more dynamic atmosphere in the classroom. People volunteer their suggestions, their views. However, when they get to junior high school and they are thrown into the competitive side of education where there are entrance exams for high schools, there are entrance exams for each university throughout Japan. The competition to get the highest grade leads them towards a rote learning style. So rather than asking the why and the how, or what do you think, students are fed or spoon fed rather than scaffolded. They are spoon fed a lot of information and are taught to memorize things for tests. That holds well for high school, and in some cases at university as well, depending on the course that they're taking. However, when you get into a discussion type situation and you're asking for opinions, they haven't been trained in an educational sense to freely offer their opinions at a stage in their life where they should, in that adolescent time when they should be pushed to be confident in having an opinion on things. So this can actually be a point of frustration, but it's important to learn. And also the way they communicate. So here we see four kanji, or Japanese characters, which are read Kisho Tenketsu. And this is the flow of communication that they are taught to adhere to. And it can be from another cultural point of view where we're more direct and we start with the conclusion, the anticlimax order. What is the point of what we're trying to say? We start with that first and then give our reasons next. However, for Japanese, they start with a lot of background information that may be relative and may not be. They start with the big picture. So they communicate much like a PhD thesis. They have an abstract. They don't even have an abstract, they have an introduction. They have the current literature review. They then get into the research question and problem. They then analyze it. So it can be, from, I'd say, from where I stand, somewhat frustrating if my expectation is just purely driven by my own culture. So, depending on which culture I'm placed, I then have to make that decision. How do I change the way I communicate? So, for Japanese, one of my points for many of the students is that if they were looking to take their graduate studies overseas, is they have to learn a more open, expressive way of communicating and get to the point and rationalize what they're trying to say in a clear and concise way earlier rather than later, especially when we're talking about this verbal communication act. So that's just some background information to why, if you've dealt with Japanese, you might feel some things are rather long winded. It's obviously the way they've been trained. Now, another important thing to remember here is that where do we all sit on the communication style sort of scale? And in intercultural communication studies, one sort of explanation that's often referred to is the framework of high context and low context communication. Now, maybe again, some of you may be familiar with these terms and some may not. But before I go on to explain it, I'll just show you where some countries lie. So as we can see here, Japan is very much a high context communication culture. Whereas the further to the right we go, the right of your screen, and we get more into England, France, America, Germany, Switzerland, etc., they become more low context. So knowing where you sit on that scale is also a very important point of reference to use so you know what to expect before dealing with these people. Again, a lot of it is in the preparation, and that's part of that knowledge area of cultural intelligence, enhancing your cultural understanding so that you can then develop your strategy because you know what to expect, rather than not knowing beforehand and being thrown right into it without any references, which again can create unnecessary stress and also a bit of culture shock. And that's something we want to avoid where possible. So, high context and low context. What am I referring to here? Well, the characteristics, first of all, for high context, there's a lot of use of vague or indirect expressions, less verbal explanation. And what I mean by that is it's not what being said, but sometimes what's not being said that's more important, which means that we sometimes need to read between the lines. And that's expected. And if that's the norm in that culture, like it is in Japan, you don't need to say a lot for your intentions to be heard. So, on the flip side, we then have to rely on a lot of nonverbal cues. So, picking up on body language, picking up on the way silence is used, the frequency or the opposite of, how much eye contact, the tone, etc. And that means that they become more emotionally sensitive when they're reading another person's emotions. so that emotional intelligence comes in a high context communication style. On the other side, we have low context. So naturally, it's not, difficult. I'm sure you've worked it out already. More clear, clearer, more direct expressions, more verbal explanation. It's more logical, getting to the point and then reasoning and the rationale next. And so before I go to the next slide, sorry about that. The more verbal explanation means that we naturally we rely more on the verbal. So when you have these two cultures together, you obviously have some breakdown in communication if you're expecting each other to follow your own rules. So knowing how you're different there can actually help you create those strategies in the middle. But again, that takes a lot of open conversation or a lot of practice and a bit of trial and error, to be honest. But to break it down in the workplace, for example, in the workplace for high context, especially in Japan, as a point of reference, what that means is that interpersonal relationships are important. Okay, because we're not heavily reliant on the verbal so much. It's that sense of teamwork, that ability to read each other's nonverbal cues, that interpersonal relationship that becomes very important. Which leads to the area of group cohesiveness, working as a group, sharing values, and consensus. There's a lot of consensus work that goes on in Japan, a lot of setting up of an idea. Can be, again, very frustrating if you come from a more direct approach, a more top down approach. But building that consensus actually instills a sense of shared responsibility. And for the Japanese, that group responsibility, because there's a lot of job sharing, etc., a lot of job rotation, that sort of group responsibility is one of the pillars or one of the clogs that help the wheel turn. And as I've pointed to before, reading between the lines, this guesswork is expected. There's a private face that we have, and there's a public face that we have. And learning to switch between the two and not being overly honest, because that could create unnecessary confrontation. We rather leave sentences unfinished because the other person should automatically get what we're trying to say. Now, on the other side, in a low context situation, that then refers to obviously a more individualistic mindset, and your mindset and your values are prioritized. You have a more defined role, and for that, you have responsibilities, you have decision making power. And that's something that Japanese are not used to, because not one person holds all the power. Again, that shared responsibility means that you share in the success or you share in the failure. Whereas when you come from a more performance based society, even in academia, the way you approach it is very much, I guess, driven by your own set of values and your own ways of thinking as well. Another area, of course, is that in order for everything to gel and for communication to go well, things have to be clear and concise. The information that you share should be clear and concise, and that is expected. And finally, work ethic is based on the decisions and the actions that we make. And again, it comes down to an individual responsibility, whereas Japan can be very much focused on, are we all on board? To give you an example, in our faculty meetings, when we have a new idea we want to propose, it's not just a matter of putting that on the agenda and having it heard and being given time to explain the idea for it to be approved or to be discussed, to be brainstormed. All of that should be done beforehand. So what that involves is something what Japanese refer to as nemawashi, which refers to going around the roots of a tree before moving that tree successfully and smoothly to the next location. It's originally a gardening term, but in a workplace that means going around your colleagues informally to discuss the idea you want to propose in a formal situation such as a faculty meeting, a senate meeting, etc. So you're getting that informal consent, feedback, input from your colleagues, and in that way, they are buying into the idea because they're given the chance to give their input. And if you're able to reflect their input, it not it's not then just your idea, it's a shared idea. And because it's a shared idea, that means there's shared responsibility. And people will work harder for the success or to guarantee the success of its implementation. So, again, it's a very time consuming activity, but there you need to be aware of that cultural sort of framework. And that, in a nutshell, is the use of cultural intelligence. So, in summary, for me, I would say that successful intercultural communication is made up of 5 areas. We can use this when we're dealing with students from different cultural backgrounds. We can use this when we're dealing with colleagues or working with colleagues, again, from diverse backgrounds. It begins first with knowing yourself, because at some stage you're going to have to reach a point of compromise, and that means being able to persuade each other of your mutual viewpoints. Also, knowing the others, taking the time to recognize what is similar and what is different to your norms. These two then will then link directly to the way you communicate. Because you have a better appreciation, you're more sensitive, you're more aware of what small adjustments you might need to make mutually so that the communication is smooth and successful. And from that, we then are able to produce shared decisions and actions that everyone buys into. But to do that, and in any diverse, interculturally diverse situation, whether it be supervising a student or whether it be working with colleagues from different backgrounds, we must be willing to compromise. And compromise is just another way of saying mutually respect and also accept that there are many different normals around the world. So, on that note, I will finish the presentation side of it. I'll click out of the share screen, and if you have any questions or if you have any experiences yourself that you would like to share for the remainder of the time, I'll open the floor to everyone's comments.